This is not a traffic jam. This is a siege, the last lifeline feeding Vladimir Putin's war machine, carrying tens of thousands of kilometers of steel and technology, has been cut off. But it was not stopped by a missile, but by a customs officer. A decision from Kazakhstan has closed one of Russia's main supply routes from China. Over 7,500 trucks and trailers are stranded. Inspections are ongoing, and goods are being seized. Drones, electronic warfare equipment, batteries, components, nothing is getting through. Initially, Russian authorities were searching every vehicle at the Kazakh border and allowing passage only under strict rules. This move was not a threat to Kazakhstan, but an opportunity. The Astana administration had been fed up with Moscow's regional bullying and economic pressure for years. Russia's own new rules provided them with the perfect excuse for retaliation. Kazakhstan, Russia's closest ally, responded by turning this chaos into a perfect weapon. On October 8, 2025, Kazakh officials, citing the need to comply with international sanctions, effectively shut down all technology-laden trucks coming from China and heading to Russia. This decision triggered a massive logistical nightmare that instantly spread across tens of thousands of square kilometers. Border crossings suddenly became impassable barriers. The slowdown initiated by Russian customs officials, combined with the complete blockade by the Kazakh side, resulted in one of the largest truck graveyards in history. Satellite images and videos from local sources document miles of helplessly waiting truck queues stretching across Kazakhstan's endless steppes. The numbers reveal the gravity of the situation. Initially, a few hundred stranded vehicles quickly grew to thousands. Then, as confirmed by independent logistics platforms and even Kazakh MPs, reached an unimaginable 7,500. The queues stretch for miles. Fearing inspections, many drivers enter parking lots or seek alternative routes through Mongolia. Those caught in the middle of this chaos were not only Russians and Kazakhs. A significant portion of that massive convoy consisted of Chinese drivers bringing goods directly from the source. These people, who had been on the road for weeks, stranded in a geography where they did not know the language or the rules, began to tremble with fear of being subjected to Russia's arbitrary seizures, heavy fines, and prison sentences for absurd charges such as smuggling. A Kazakh MP said in a statement on Monday that Russia's new border restrictions risked forcing truck drivers in the country to technically violate Russian laws, causing Kazakhstan to lose vital trade access through Russia and Belarus. Russian drivers have literally vanished from logistics networks across the country, according to information verified by OSINT analysts. Some have cut off contact, leaving their cargo in parking lots and abandoned industrial areas. Others have diverted to alternative routes, such as Mongolia, which are free from inspection. This was actually a disaster for Russia. However, Russia's survival strategy under Western sanctions was based on a single word: parallel imports. With the start of the Ukraine war and the unprecedented wave of Western sanctions, Russia faced a complete blockade in terms of supplying advanced technology and industrial products. Critical parts and machinery from Europe, the US, and Japan were suddenly cut off. Putin's war machine could no longer produce modern weapons, repair its tanks, or renew its drones. This is where China stepped in as a savior. Russia established a massive network called parallel imports to circumvent Western sanctions. One of the main arteries of this network was the land route stretching from China through Kazakhstan to Russia. Thousands of trucks carried critical components such as microchips, sensors, specialized machinery, drone parts, and advanced electronic assemblies produced in Chinese factories for both civilian and military use. These products were the lifeblood of Russia's defense industry. Without them, Russian tanks would be left stranded on the battlefield. Missiles could not be produced, and UAVs could not take flight. This back door was the dirty secret that kept Putin's factories running. But this lifeblood was unexpectedly blocked. Thousands of trucks loaded with goods from China piled up at checkpoints on the Russia-Kazakhstan border, forming queues stretching for miles. It all began with the Kremlin's paranoia about control, which it initiated against its own allies within its own borders. However, this move was not an attempt by Moscow to gain control, but rather a shot fired at its own foot. Russian customs officials began meticulously searching nearly all sensitive cargo, subject to Western sanctions or suspected of being dual use. These inspections took days, even weeks. This situation not only extended delivery times by weeks, but also halted the flow of parts and raw materials vital to Russian industry, bringing production to a standstill. Fearing the inspections, many Chinese and Kazakh drivers either pulled into parking lots to wait or began looking for alternative, much more expensive routes through Mongolia. Their goal was to avoid being at the mercy of a Russian customs officer and having their loaded cargo held hostage for days. This situation not only extended delivery times by weeks, but also halted production by cutting off the flow of parts and raw materials vital to Russian industry. Russian factories are waiting for parts. Those parts are being held hostage by Russian customs officials at the Russian border. The chaos at the border was not a simple traffic jam. It was the result of a ruthless game of diplomatic chess being played behind the scenes. The West's, particularly the US's, diplomatic pressure and threat of secondary sanctions on countries within Russia's traditional sphere of influence, such as Kazakhstan, was the main factor triggering this logistical disaster. Kazakhstan had to sacrifice Russia in order to protect its own economy and not risk its relations with the West. This was a move that showed how fragile Putin's influence over his so-called allies was and diplomatically cornered him. Putin and Xi Jinping had declared unlimited friendship to the world. However, this crisis proved how fake and based on mistrust this friendship was. Underlying Russia's initiation of these strict controls was the suspicion that Chinese companies, fearing secondary sanctions from the West, were either not sending sensitive products to Russia or were sending substandard goods. Moscow feared that Beijing was deceiving it and not providing sufficient support. On the other hand, for China, every truck waiting at the border meant a loss. One of the most important land corridors of China's Belt and Road project, extending to Europe, was blocked due to the incompetence and paranoia of its ally, Russia. This showed that the interests of the two countries did not fully coincide. While China wanted to use Russia as an ally against the West, the economic and logistical chaos Russia had fallen into was also becoming a burden for China. Moreover, the truck queues at the Kazakh border were not a simple logistical problem. This was a targeted logistical strangulation operation, triggered by Western diplomatic pressure, undermining Putin's doctrine of a sanctions-resistant economy. This move had the potential to create a final domino effect that would deprive the Russian defense industry of vital Chinese technology and bring production to a standstill. Let's decipher this domino effect step by following the journey of a single critical component. Let that component be a high-precision FPGA microchip designed in the West. This small silicon component is the brain of a modern weapon system. It is the invisible intelligence that enables an Iskander missile to find its target, an Orlan UAV to stabilize its camera, or a T-90M tank's fire control system to lock onto a target. These chips are on the West's strictest sanctions list, and it is impossible for Russia to obtain them legally. The journey begins at an unnamed factory in Shenzhen, China's technology hub. These chips are carefully concealed among civilian products, labeled as industrial automation units or medical device components through front companies. The aim is to give the appearance of an innocent commercial shipment at first glance. Then, this valuable cargo is loaded onto a truck that departs from China and sets off on that long and winding road that is part of the One Belt, One Road project. The truck passes through China and then Kazakhstan without incident for thousands of kilometers. This is a routine operation, demonstrating the flawless functioning of the system known as parallel import. However, the real nightmare begins at the final stop of the journey, at the dusty and crowded customs gate on the Kazakhstan-Russia border. Normally, these trucks from the neighboring country should pass through in a few hours, but now the situation is different. Due to the West's secondary sanctions threats and the Kremlin's internal witch hunt paranoia, Russian customs officials now view every Chinese truck as a potential threat. The truck undergoes an X-ray scan. An experienced officer notices the suspicious density inside the industrial automation units. The cargo is unloaded, the crates are opened with crowbars, and the real treasure hidden beneath the fake labels, thousands of banned microchips, is revealed. From that moment on, the world stops for that truck and its driver. The cargo is sealed indefinitely in a customs warehouse for additional investigation to determine its origin and intended use. The driver falls into a bureaucratic hell that can last weeks, even months. Now, let's move the scene thousands of kilometers east, to Ural Vagonzavod, Russia's largest tank factory, located beyond the Ural Mountains. On the factory's massive assembly line, dozens of new T-90M tank hulls, almost complete, are waiting silently. But there is a problem. The tank's brains, their fire control systems, cannot be installed, because the critical FPGA chips needed to run those systems never arrived. The factory manager makes phone calls to the Defense Ministry in Moscow and to suppliers. The answer is always the same. The shipment is stuck at the Kazakh border. It's unclear when it will arrive. The production line stops. Thousands of workers are either furloughed without pay or assigned to meaningless tasks like cleaning the factory grounds. Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway bridge has been paralyzed. The railway, which connects Russia to Pacific ports, the front lines, and China, was sabotaged with a bomb attack. And that bomb didn't just derail a train, it simultaneously blew up Putin's entire strategic equation, his dreams of turning toward Asia, and the illusion that his regime was unshakable. However, the real shock of this attack came not from the explosion itself, but from the chilling statement made by the FSB hours later. This daring sabotage was not carried out by a Ukrainian Special Forces team or a foreign agent. The person who pulled the trigger and placed the bomb on the tracks was a Russian citizen, an ordinary Russian, allegedly recruited by Ukrainian intelligence. At that moment, Putin's worst nightmare came true. The enemy was no longer at the door, but inside the house. In August 2025, an ordinary Russian woman in her 50s decided she would no longer remain silent. She contacted Ukrainian intelligence. She was neither a soldier nor a trained agent, but she had an idea. Could this be a way to stop the destruction this war was bringing to her children and her country? She prepared a simple, homemade explosive device. The instructions were clear, the target was clear. In mid-September, on a railway line in eastern Siberia, she placed the device on the tracks just minutes before a train passed. The explosion occurred, but this was not just a broken rail. This attack was a fracture at the weakest point of long-accumulated structural pressure. Because this railway was no ordinary line, it was the Trans-Siberian line. Stretching from the Pacific coast to Moscow, then on to the Ukrainian front, it carried goods from China alongside military logistics on the same track. It was not just iron, but one of the regime's lifelines. Moreover, with Russia's nearly all trade routes to the west closed due to sanctions, the Kremlin's forced reliance on this eastern corridor had transformed the line from a strategic asset into a fragile dependency. All these factors created perfect timing for Ukraine. To better understand the timing of the attack, we need to look at two key factors. First, the message conveyed by the attacker. Second, the moment when the target was vulnerable. And in this attack, both factors coincided. From Russia's perspective, this period marked a serious bottleneck in rail freight transport. In 2024, the total freight volume of Russian railways fell to 1.18 billion tons. This was recorded as the lowest level in the last 15 years. On the surface, trade with China had increased, but railway capacity remained static and had even decreased on some lines. Spare parts embargoes had increased the frequency of locomotive breakdowns. Finding train drivers had become difficult. Eastern corridors like the Baikal-Amur main line and the Trans-Siberian Railway were operating far beyond capacity due to lack of investment, making each new train passage a balancing act. The flow had changed direction, but the pipeline remained the same. Moreover, the pressure inside was increasing day by day. The sabotage that occurred at this very moment was not like a small explosion. It was like a trigger deliberately pulled on the weakest link in the system. Immediately after the explosion, the train queues that began to accumulate in the east of the line, i.e. in Russia's Far East, were a nightmare for the Kremlin's military planners. What was in those wagons? Modernized T-80 tanks waiting to replace those lost in Ukraine. Thousands of artillery shells expended daily. Wagons carrying soldiers, and most importantly, fuel and supplies vital for winter conditions. All this military supply was suddenly trapped in the middle of Siberia, behind a wreckage that could take weeks, even months to repair. This was deadly news for the tens of thousands of Russian soldiers fighting on the front lines in Ukraine. The factory cannot fulfill its production commitment to the state. This situation is not just an economic loss, it is the beginning of a chain reaction of military disaster. The next link in this domino effect is a Russian armored brigade on the Donetsk front in Ukraine. This brigade lost half of its tanks in the summer's fierce attacks and has been waiting for months for new T-90M tanks to be sent from Moscow. However, those tanks are sitting idle in a factory in the Urals, reduced to piles of metal because of a single microchip. Without reinforcements, this brigade becomes even more vulnerable on the front line against Ukraine's modern Western tanks and anti-tank missiles. The main reason for the heavy losses this brigade will suffer and its forced retreat in the next Ukrainian counter-offensive is not a tactical error at the front, but the bureaucratic paralysis at a customs post thousands of kilometers away. This is not just the story of a single chip or a single factory. This is currently a reality across Russia's entire defense industry, affecting hundreds of different critical components. Precision machine tools, special alloys, optical sensors, communication modules. Every part that keeps the Russian war machine running in the 21st century is now dependent on this parallel import gamble. And that gamble is now being lost. Every truck stopped at the border slows down the production line of a factory in a different corner of Russia. Every factory that slows down production means a different unit at the front is left without equipment. Every unit left without equipment brings Russia one step closer to defeat against Ukraine. This domino effect is not limited to the military sphere. It also hits the entire country economically and socially. A factory that halts production cannot pay taxes. This further widens the gap in the state budget, already riddled with holes due to the war. It cannot pay its workers' salaries. This creates the risk of mass unemployment and social unrest in industrial cities like Nizhny Tagil, where life depends entirely on that one factory. This is where the true genius of the West's sanctions strategy and diplomatic pressure on transit countries like Kazakhstan lies. The goal is not to topple Russia in one fell swoop. The goal is like an anaconda slowly constricting its prey, tightening its grip with every breath to suffocate it. Each sanction, each diplomatic move, slows the flow of blood to the veins of the Russian economy and war machine. The chaos at the Kazakh border is one of the most successful and destructive moves in this strangulation operation. This move leaves Russia with three difficult choices. The first is to relax its own customs controls and facilitate the entry of Chinese-made parts into the country. However, this would clearly defy the red line drawn by the West, because this relaxation would pave the way for secondary sanctions not only against Russia, but also against Chinese exporters and Kazakh transporters. The European Union and the US are determined to punish every link in the chain if dual-use products such as semiconductors, optical systems, and communication equipment find their way back into Russia. Therefore, such a step by Putin would mean a painful choice between giving his domestic market a lifeline and becoming more severely isolated from the outside world. The second and more striking possibility is that China would step in directly and issue an economic warning to Russia. Seeing its exporters lose billions of dollars, Beijing could demand that Moscow ease the supply chain. This could come in the form of an ultimatum, conveyed through diplomatic channels, even if not publicly announced. Such a move would represent not only an economic, but also an ideological break for Putin. This is because Russia-China relations, defined for years by the principle of unlimited friendship, would at this point be reduced to pure commercial interests. China's pressure undermines Putin's rhetoric of independence in foreign policy and reveals the limits of the Kremlin's strategy of turning to the east. At the same time, it becomes one of the first clear examples of China turning its trade-based power into a diplomatic pressure tool, setting an example for other Eurasian countries. The third and most costly option is to turn to alternative routes. Russia and China may try to implement new land transport routes via Mongolia or sea routes along the North Pole to reduce pressure on the Kazakhstan line. However, these routes are not only longer, but also more expensive, more seasonal, and have much lower capacity. Arctic sea transport in particular is only possible with icebreaker escort vessels because it is covered in ice for most of the year, which multiplies insurance costs, energy consumption, and transport time. For Russia, already in an economic straitjacket due to war and sanctions, this type of logistical alternative is not a viable option in the short term. Moreover, increased traffic on these routes will also expand the West's surveillance radar. Therefore, every new path Russia is forced to open to access technology will bring with it strategic, economic, and diplomatic risks. Ultimately, Russia found itself in a perfect trap. It was subjected to both a technology embargo imposed by Kazakhstan from the outside and a logistics revolt initiated by its own citizens from within. Russia lost this game not to Ukraine or NATO, but to its own paranoia and incompetence. Kazakhstan cleverly exploited the leverage it gained, turning the Kremlin's mistake into a trap. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to support our independent analyses.